There was a boy in Malaga who could draw before he could write his full name, and his father, who was an artist himself and a teacher of drawing at the provincial school, watched him with a mixture of pride and something closer to unease. The boy was born on the 25th of October in 1881 in an apartment on the Plaza de la Merced, and the midwife thought at first he had come into the world stillborn. He did not cry. His uncle, a doctor, blew cigar smoke into the infant's face, and only then did the child begin to breathe and wail. His mother would say later that this was the first sign of his will, that he had to be provoked into living. They named him Pablo Diego José Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno María de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. A name so long it contained multitudes, though the world would come to know him by the shortest version. The maternal surname that sounded like a hammer striking stone. Malaga in those years was a port city on the southern coast of Spain, white buildings climbing up from the Mediterranean, palms and dusty streets and the smell of the sea mixed with the smell of jasmine. The light there had a particular quality, sharp and clean, the kind of light that made edges visible and cast shadows with absolute clarity. The boy grew up in that light. His father, José Ruiz Blasco, painted pigeons mostly, careful academic studies of birds that were decorative and competent and utterly conventional. He had wanted to be a great painter and had become instead a teacher and a curator at the local museum, a man whose ambitions had quietly failed him but who still carried brushes and painted in the evenings with a kind of dutiful melancholy. He recognized in his son something he had never possessed himself. The boy did not copy the world the way other children did, with the clumsy approximation of the untrained hand. He seemed to understand it, to see through the surface to the structure underneath. By the time Pablo was 7 or 8, he was drawing with a fluency that seemed impossible, animals and people rendered with an assurance that belonged to someone much older. José began to use his son as an assistant. He would have Pablo fill in the backgrounds of his pigeon paintings, the talons and the feathers, and he watched as the boy did this work without hesitation, without the usual tentative marks of a child learning. There are stories, perhaps embellished, but no less revealing, for that, of the moment José decided to stop painting altogether. He came home one afternoon and found his 13-year-old son finishing one of his canvases, a still life with pigeons, and the boy had painted the birds with such life, such command, that José felt something collapse inside him. He handed Pablo his palette and his brushes, and said he would not paint again. Whether this happened exactly as the story suggests, or whether it was a slower recognition spread across months or years, the meaning is the same. The father understood that his son had already surpassed him, and rather than compete or resent, he surrendered. He gave Pablo everything he knew, and then he stepped aside. The family moved to La Coruña in the northwest when Pablo was 10, a colder, rainier city where José had found a teaching position. Pablo continued to draw and paint, working through the exercises his father set for him, copying plaster casts and learning anatomy, perspective, the grammar of academic art. But even then there was something restless in him, an impatience with the slowness of instruction. He filled sketchbooks with studies of hands and faces, beggars and street scenes, quick notations of the world moving around him. His father enrolled him in the School of Fine Arts in La Coruña, where at 11 he was already working at a level far beyond his age. The other students must have watched him with envy or bewilderment, this small boy who could render a human figure with a few sure strokes, who never seemed to struggle the way they did. In 1895, when Pablo was 13, the family moved again, this time to Barcelona, where José had secured another post. Barcelona was a different world from Malaga or La Coruña, a modern city alive with industry and art and political ferment. It was here that Pablo truly began to form, not just as a technician but as an artist with a vision. He enrolled in the School of Fine Arts, known as La Locha, where his father also taught. The entrance exam required a month's work, and Pablo completed it in a single day. They admitted him immediately, placing him in the advanced classes alongside students years older. He was 14. He set up a studio space with a friend, and he began to paint in earnest, large academic canvases that showed he had mastered everything the schools could teach him. There was a painting he made at 15, First Communion, that depicted his younger sister Lola kneeling at an altar, a work so technically accomplished, so conventionally beautiful, that it could have been painted by any competent academic artist of the time. It was impressive and utterly unremarkable, which is to say it was exactly what his training had prepared him to make, and already he seemed to know it was not enough. He spent his evenings at Els Quatre Gats, a café modeled after the Chat Noir in Paris, where artists and writers gathered to talk about modernism and anarchism and the new ideas flooding in from the rest of Europe. He met Jamie Sabartez there, who would become a lifelong friend and later his secretary, and Carlos Casagemas, a poet and painter who was fragile and intense, and who Pablo loved in the way young men love their first real friends. With an almost romantic fervor, they talked about leaving Spain, about going to Paris, which was the center of everything, the place where art was being reinvented. Barcelona was vital, but Paris was the world. In October of 1900, just after his 19th birthday, Pablo left for Paris with Casagemas. They took a studio in Montmartre, on the Rue Gabrielle, and Pablo stepped into the city that would define the rest of his life. Paris at the turn of the century was a place of astonishing energy, a city where the old century and the new one were colliding. The Eiffel Tower, barely a decade old, still seemed like an audacious affront to tradition. The métro had just opened. The streets were full of anarchists and socialists, artists from every corner of Europe, performers and criminals and immigrants. The avant-garde was not yet a historical movement, but a living argument about what art could be. Toulouse-Lautrec was still alive, painting his posters of the Moulin Rouge. Cézanne was working in isolation in Aix-en-Provence, barely known but beginning to be whispered about. The nobbies, the symbolists, the impressionists and their aftermath, it was all still unfolding, still unsettled. Pablo and Casagemas moved through this world with the hunger of young men who had come from the provinces and wanted everything at once. They went to cafés and cabarets, to galleries in the Louvre. They painted. But something was wrong with Casagemas. He had fallen in love with a woman named Germaine Gargallo, a model and dancer, and she did not return his feelings, or not in the way he needed. He became despondent, obsessive. In December, Pablo took him back to Malaga, hoping the warmth and the distance from Paris would help, but it did not. They returned to Barcelona, and in February of 1901, Casagemas invited Germaine and a group of friends to a dinner at a restaurant. Near the end of the evening he stood up, pulled out a revolver, and shot at Germaine. He missed. Then he turned the gun on himself and did not miss. He died there, in front of everyone, his blood pooling on the floor. Pablo was not present, but the news reached him almost immediately, and it shattered something. Casagemas had been his closest friend, his companion in the adventure of becoming an artist, and now he was gone, and the manner of his death-violent public, rooted in a kind of romantic despair, left Pablo haunted. He returned to Paris in the spring, and he began to paint in a way he had not before. The colors drained from his canvases. He painted beggars and prostitutes, blind men and women hunched in sorrow, figures isolated against empty backgrounds. He painted Casagemas dead, his face waxen and still. He painted Casagemas ascending into a bright heaven that looked like a parody of consolation. The paintings were blue, not just tinged with blue but saturated in it, a cold, mournful blue that seemed to seep into every corner of the canvas. This became known later as the Blue Period, though at the time it was not a period but simply the work he was making, day after day, in a studio that was barely heated and where he sometimes burned his own drawings to stay warm. The Blue Period paintings are about loneliness, about people who exist at the edges of society and who have been forgotten or discarded. There's La Vie, painted in 1903, a large canvas that shows Casagemas naked, standing with a woman, while another woman holding a baby stands to the side, and between them are sketches of more figures, huddled and sorrowful. The painting is a meditation on life and death, on love and isolation, and it does not resolve into a single meaning. It hangs there, melancholic and mysterious. There is the old guitarist, a man bent over his instrument, his body all angles and emaciation, painted in shades of blue and brown, and the guitar is the only warm thing in the painting, the only object that seems to hold any life. These paintings were not popular. They were too sad, too monochrome, too far from the decorative pleasures that collectors wanted. Pablo was living in poverty, sharing studios, moving from one cheap room to another, sometimes going days without a proper meal. He was not yet 25 years old, and he had already developed a fully mature style that no one wanted to buy, and yet he kept painting. He had a dealer by then, a man named Pedro Maña, who gave him a small stipend and organized a show, but the show did not sell well. Pablo began to move back and forth between Paris and Barcelona, unable to afford staying in one place for long. He was learning what it meant to be an artist outside the academy, outside the system of official salons and state commissions, and what it meant was hunger and cold, and the constant anxiety of money. But he was also learning his own power. He was learning that he could take the human figure, which had been rendered in more or less the same way for centuries, and make it convey something that felt new, or at least newly urgent. The blue paintings are not realistic, but neither are they simply expressionistic. They exist in a middle space, where the distortions are subtle enough that you feel them before you see them, where the elongation of a body or the blankness of a face carries an emotional weight that bypasses argument. In 1904, the blue began to recede. He met Fernande Olivier, a model who became his lover, and the presence of love, or at least companionship, seemed to shift something in his palette. The paintings became warmer, tinged with rose and ochre and soft reds. He began to paint circus performers, acrobats and harlequins, figures who lived on the margins but who moved with grace and beauty. The Rose period, as it came to be called, is gentler than what came before, but it is not sentimental. There is still isolation in these paintings, still a sense of people who do not quite belong to the world around them. Family of Saltimbanques, painted in 1905, shows a group of circus performers standing in a barren landscape, each figure separate, none of them touching or even looking at each other. They are together and alone at the same time, which is perhaps the condition of anyone who makes their living performing, presenting a self that is not quite the self they are. Pablo was beginning to be known, at least in certain circles. He moved into a building in Montmartre called the Bateau Lavoie, a ramshackle structure that housed dozens of artists and poets in tiny, freezing studios. Max Jacob was there, a poet who became a close friend. Guillaume Apollinaire, the poet and critic, began to visit and to write about Pablo's work. The American writer Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo started buying his paintings, and their salon became a gathering place for the new art. Gertrude sat for Pablo, and he painted her portrait over the course of many sessions, more than 80 or 90 sittings, and he still was not satisfied. He scraped the face off and left the canvas unfinished for months. When he returned to it, he repainted her face from memory, giving her a mask-like quality, heavy and archaic, that had nothing to do with her actual features, and everything to do with a new way of seeing he was moving toward. He had begun to look at things other than European painting. He saw African masks and Iberian sculpture, ancient carved figures that did not try to be lifelike but instead abstracted the human form into shapes that felt powerful and essential. He saw how these objects did not rely on perspective or naturalism, how they communicated something direct and raw. He also looked at Cézanne, who had died in 1906 and whose paintings were being shown in a large retrospective. Cézanne had broken the world into planes and angles, had refused the seamless illusions of Renaissance space, and Pablo understood that what Cézanne had begun he could take further. He could break the figure itself, not just the space around it. In 1907 he began a painting that would later be called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It was a large canvas, nearly 8 feet tall, and it depicted 5 female nudes in a shallow, fragmented space. The title referred to a brothel on a street in Barcelona, and the figures were prostitutes, but they were not painted with the erotic gloss that usually accompanied such subjects. They were confrontational, angular, disturbing. The 2 figures on the right had faces that looked like African masks, sharp and distorted. The 3 on the left were less overtly mask-like, but still fractured, their bodies composed of overlapping planes that seemed to exist in multiple perspectives at once. There was no depth in the traditional sense, no illusion that you could walk into the space of the painting. Instead, the figures seemed to push forward, to invade your space, to refuse the distance that painting usually maintained between the viewer and the viewed. He worked on it for months, making studies, repainting sections, and when he finally showed it to his friends, they were horrified. George Braque, a young painter he had recently met, said it was as if Pablo wanted them to drink kerosene and spit fire. Matisse thought it was a joke or an insult to the modern movement. Even Apollinaire, usually a champion, was unsure. The painting was too violent, too ugly, too far from anything that could be called beautiful. Pablo rolled it up and did not show it publicly for years. But he did not abandon what he had discovered in making it. He had found a way to take the human figure apart and reassemble it, according to a logic that was not about imitation but about structure and multiplicity. He had found a way to show a body from multiple angles at once, to collapse time and space onto a single surface. He had invented, though he did not yet have a name for it, Cubism. Braque came back to look at the painting again, and this time he saw something. He understood what Pablo was attempting, and he began to paint in a similar way, breaking landscapes into facets and planes, flattening space, rejecting the single viewpoint that had governed Western painting since the Renaissance. The 2 of them began to work in parallel, showing each other their paintings, pushing each other further. They joked that they were like 2 mountaineers roped together, ascending a peak that no one else could see. The paintings they made between 1908 and 1912 are the heart of Cubism, the analytical phase where the world was taken apart piece by piece. They painted still lifes, bottles and guitars and newspapers, but rendered them so abstractly that the objects were barely recognizable. They painted portraits where the face was shattered into overlapping fragments, where you could see the front and the side and the back of the head at the same time. They were not interested in beauty or emotion in the traditional sense. They were interested in how vision itself worked, how the mind assembled an image from multiple sensations, and they tried to make paintings that mirrored that process. Pablo's dealer by this time was Daniel Henry Kahnweiler, a young German who had opened a gallery in Paris and who believed absolutely in what Pablo and Braque were doing. He bought their paintings steadily, even when no one else would, and he wrote essays explaining Cubism to a baffled public. He organized shows in Germany and Russia, and slowly the movement began to spread. Other artists started painting in a Cubist manner: Juan Gris, Fernand Léger, Robert Delaunay. What had seemed like the private obsession of 2 painters became a movement, a new language that other artists could use and transform. But Pablo was always moving. By 1912, Cubism had become almost too abstract, too hermetic. He and Braque began to introduce elements of the real world back into their paintings, not by painting them illusionistically, but by collaging them directly onto the canvas. Scraps of newspaper, pieces of oilcloth printed to look like chair caning, labels from bottles thieves were glued onto the surface, breaking the integrity of the painted image and making the painting an object itself, something constructed rather than something that created an illusion. This was the synthetic phase of Cubism, and it opened up possibilities that would echo through the rest of the century. Collage became a technique that almost every modern artist would use in some form, a way of bringing the world into the work without representing it. Fernande left him in 1912. She had been with him for nearly 8 years, and she had been the subject of many paintings, but the relationship had become strained. Pablo had affairs. He was possessive and jealous and also unfaithful, a combination that made living with him difficult. She moved out and Pablo quickly took up with a new lover, a young woman named Marcel Humbert, whom he called Eva. He painted her name into his cubist canvases, Ma Jolie, a song lyric that also meant, my pretty one, and the letters floated among the fragmented planes, a declaration and a code. He was deeply in love with her, or at least he said he was, and the paintings from this period have a tenderness that the earlier cubist work sometimes lacked. But Eva was sick. She had tuberculosis, though it was not diagnosed right away, and over the next few years her health deteriorated. The First World War began in August of 1914, and Paris emptied. Braque and Apollinaire and many of Pablo's other friends enlisted or were conscripted. Pablo, as a Spanish citizen, was not required to serve, and he stayed in Paris, painting in a city that had become strange and subdued. The collaboration with Braque, the intense back and forth that had defined Cubism, was over. Braque went to the front and was badly wounded in 1915, a head injury that required surgery and left him changed. The war fractured the avant-garde, scattering artists and disrupting the sense of collective experimentation that had flourished before. Pablo continued to work, but the urgency had shifted. Eva died in December of 1915, and he was devastated. He painted less for a while, or at least he painted differently, returning to a more naturalistic style in some works, as if the abstraction of Cubism could not hold the weight of grief. In 1917, he was invited by Jean Cocteau to design sets and costumes for a ballet, Parade, which was being produced by Sergei Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, with music by Eric Satie. Pablo had never worked in theater before, but he was intrigued, and he traveled to Rome where the company was rehearsing. It was there that he met Olga Koklova, a Russian dancer in the company. She was beautiful and refined, from a middle-class family, and she represented a kind of respectability that Pablo had never been close to. He was in his mid-30s by then, famous in certain circles, but still living a bohemian life, still moving between studios, still surrounded by poets and anarchists and people who lived outside the conventions of bourgeois society. Olga was not bohemian. She wanted marriage, a proper home, a social life that included dinners and concerts and the theater. Pablo courted her, and they married in July of 1918, just before the war ended. The marriage changed his life in visible ways. They moved into an apartment on the Rue La Boitie, a fashionable address on the right bank, far from the chaos of Montmartre and Montparnasse. The apartment was large and elegantly furnished, and Pablo set up a studio there where he worked in a more orderly fashion, surrounded by dealers and collectors and society figures. He began to paint in a neoclassical style, large figures rendered with a monumental solidity that seemed to reference ancient Greece or Rome. These paintings confused people. They did not look like Cubism. They did not look like anything he had done before. But Pablo did not see a contradiction. He believed he could paint in any style he wanted. That style was a tool to be picked up and set down as needed. He painted classical nudes at the same time he was still making cubist collages. He was interested in everything, in trying everything, and he refused to be limited by what people expected of him. Olga gave birth to a son, Paulo, in February of 1921, and for a time Pablo painted domestic scenes, images of mother and child that were tender and almost traditional. But the marriage was not happy. Olga was demanding and anxious, concerned with appearances and social status, and Pablo felt stifled. He needed freedom, or at least he needed to feel that he had freedom, even if what he did with it caused pain to others. He began to spend more time away from the apartment to keep a separate studio, and by the late 20s the marriage was effectively over, though they did not divorce. Olga refused to grant a divorce, which under French law would have meant splitting their property, and Pablo, who had become wealthy by this time, did not want to lose his paintings. So they stayed married, living separate lives, and Olga became increasingly bitter and unwell. In January of 1927, Pablo saw a young woman standing outside a department store in Paris. Her name was Marie-Thérèse Walter. She was 17 years old, blonde and full-figured, with a face that he found endlessly compelling. He approached her and said, "I am Picasso. You and I are going to do great things together." She may not have known who he was, but she agreed to meet him again. Within weeks, they were lovers. He was 45. He kept the affair secret, renting a studio where they could meet, and he began to paint her obsessively. She appears in dozens of paintings from the late 20s and early 30s, reclining nudes with curves that are rendered as smooth, rounded forms, faces that are serene and almost blank, a kind of erotic ideal. The paintings are full of a sensual pleasure that the neoclassical works lacked, and also a kind of possession. Marie-Thérèse Fernand or Eva had been. She was a subject, a muse, someone he kept apart from the rest of his life. He began to spend summers in the countryside, at a chateau he had bought in Bois-Lac, and he set up a sculpture studio there. He had always made sculpture, small constructions and assemblages, but now he began to work in plaster and bronze, making large busts of Marie-Thérèse, heads with exaggerated features, noses that jutted out like prows, eyes that were simplified into bulges. These sculptures have a raw physicality that the paintings sometimes disguise. They look archaic and modern at the same time, like idols that belong to no particular era. He also made sculptures from found objects, a bull's head from a bicycle seat and handlebars, witty and direct. Sculpture freed him from the two-dimensional surface, allowed him to think about form and space, and he moved between painting and sculpture fluidly, each medium informing the other. In 1935, Marie-Thérèse became pregnant, and Pablo's life grew more complicated. Olga found out about the affair. Or perhaps she had always known and finally confronted him, and she left the apartment on the Rue La Boétie, taking Pablo with her. She began to follow Pablo in public, to show up at galleries and cafes, creating scenes. The marriage had become a trap for both of them, and the hostility was mutual and exhausting. Marie-Thérèse gave birth to a daughter, Maya, in September of that year, and Pablo adored the child. But he did not leave Olga, could not leave her legally, and the situation became a permanent entanglement. And then, in the spring of 1936, he met Dora Maar. She was a photographer and a painter, dark-haired and intense, involved with the Surrealists, and she was everything Marie-Thérèse was not: intellectual, independent, politically engaged. Pablo was fascinated. They met at a cafe, and the story goes that she was playing a game with a knife, stabbing it between her fingers, and she cut herself, and Pablo kept the gloves she had been wearing, stained with her blood. Whether that is precisely true or another of the many myths around him, it conveys something of the relationship's tone. Dora became his lover, and unlike Marie-Thérèse, she engaged with his work, photographed his process, argued with him about art and politics. She was a witness to the creation of what would become his most famous painting, and she documented it step by step. In April of 1937, German and Italian planes, supporting Franco's nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, bombed the town of Guernica in the Basque Country. It was a market day, and the town was full of civilians. The bombing lasted for hours, wave after wave of explosives and incendiaries, and by the end, the town was full of civilians. The bombing lasted for hours, wave after wave of explosives and incendiaries, and by the end, the town was in ruins at hundred. The attack was an experiment in terror, a deliberate targeting of a civilian population to break morale. News of the bombing reached Paris within days, and Pablo, who had remained in France throughout the war, but who followed events in Spain closely, was horrified. The Spanish Republic had recently commissioned him to paint a mural for their pavilion at the Paris World's Fair, and he had been uncertain what to do. Now he knew. He rented a large space on the Rue des Grands Augustins, a tall building with high ceilings, and he stretched a canvas that was more than 11 feet tall and 25 feet wide, a monumental surface. He began to paint in early May, working quickly, and Dora photographed the work in progress, capturing the changes and the evolution of the image. The painting that emerged was unlike anything he had made before, or that anyone had made. It was black and white and gray, a scene of chaos and suffering rendered in harsh, angular forms. There was a bull standing calmly on the left side, a figure that seemed both menacing and impassive. There was a horse in the center, its mouth open in a scream, a gaping wound in its side, its body twisted in agony. There were human figures fragmented and scattered, a woman holding a dead child, her head thrown back in a wail, a dismembered soldier on the ground, his hand still gripping a broken sword, a woman falling through a burning building, another woman rushing in from the right, her leg elongated and distorted, caught mid-stride, a figure leaning out of a window, holding a lamp above it all, a single light bulb in a jagged eye shape like a bomb or a sun. The forms overlapped and collided, and the space was flattened and compressed, so that everything seemed to happen at once, without depth or distance. It was a painting about a specific event, but it was also an image of war itself, of the horror that descends on people who have no power to stop it. Pablo finished the painting in about a month. It was installed in the Spanish pavilion at the World's Fair, where it hung alongside a sculpture by Miro and a fountain by Alexander Calder. But it was Guernica that people came to see. The response was complicated. Some saw it as a masterpiece immediately, a powerful political statement rendered with all the formal innovation that Pablo had developed over decades. Others found it cold or obscure, too cubist to be emotionally legible. But its power was undeniable. The painting did something that art rarely does. It made visible the human cost of a specific atrocity, while also turning that specificity into something universal. It was about Guernica, but it was also about every place where bombs fall on people who cannot fight back. It was not heroic or redemptive. It offered no comfort, no path forward. It was simply a witness, an image that said this happened, and it should not have happened, and the world must see. Pablo did not return to Spain after the war. Franco won, and the country fell under fascist rule, and Pablo, who had supported the Republic and who was known internationally as an opponent of fascism, could not go back. Guernica became an exile's painting, a protest made in absence. Pablo lent it to the Museum of Modern Art in New York with the stipulation that it would return to Spain only after democracy was restored. It would stay in New York for more than 40 years. The Second World War began in September of 1939, and once again Paris was transformed. The occupation came in June of 1940, and German soldiers marched through streets that had been the heart of the avant-garde. Many artists fled, to the south of France or to the United States. Pablo stayed. He was famous enough that the Germans left him largely alone, though his work was considered degenerate, and he was forbidden from exhibiting. He lived in his studio on the Rue des Grands Augustins, and he continued to work. The paintings from the war years are somber and claustrophobic, still lifes with skulls and candles, figures in dark interiors. He painted Dora Maar again and again, and in these paintings she is often distorted, her face fractured into weeping, anguished expressions. The most famous is Weeping Woman, painted in 1937 just after Guernica, where Dora's face is a cubist mask of grief, her eyes displaced, her mouth twisted, tears like shards of glass on her cheeks. She becomes a figure of suffering, the same suffering that filled Guernica, but personalized, brought into the space of an individual face. Dora later said that Pablo had turned her into a monument to pain. He joined the Communist Party in October of 1944, just after Paris was liberated. It was a public declaration, and it confused some people. He was a wealthy man by then, surrounded by luxury, and communism was supposed to be about the workers, the dispossessed. But for Pablo, the party represented resistance to fascism, solidarity with the Spanish Republicans, a connection to the political struggles that had defined his adult life. He said, "I have always been an exile. Now I am an exile no longer." The party used his membership for propaganda, and he painted a dove for a peace conference in 1949, an image that became one of the most reproduced symbols of the post-war peace movement. But his relationship with the party was complicated. When Stalin died in 1953, Pablo drew a portrait of him that the party found insufficiently reverential, and he was publicly criticized. He remained a member, but he was never a faithful ideologue. Dora's mental health had deteriorated during the war and after. The relationship with Pablo had been passionate and destructive, and when he finally ended it in 1945, she had a breakdown. She was hospitalized, underwent electroshock therapy, and never fully recovered. She lived another 50 years, painting in her studio, refusing to speak about Pablo except in carefully controlled circumstances. She had been, like Marie-Thérèse, like Olga, consumed by him, made into art, and then discarded. The pattern was clear by now. Pablo did not have relationships with women in any conventional sense. He had subjects. He painted them, sculpted them, drew them, until he had exhausted what they represented to him. And then he moved on. He said once, "There are only two kinds of women, goddesses and doormats." It was a statement that revealed how he thought, or perhaps how he wanted to be seen to think, as someone for whom women existed in categories, in roles that served his work and his ego. In 1943, he met Françoise Guillot. She was 21, an art student, and she came to his studio with a friend. Pablo was 61. She was intelligent and ambitious, and unlike the other women, she had her own artistic career, her own sense of herself, apart from him. They became lovers, and she moved into his wife, though she kept her own studio and continued to paint. She bore him 2 children, Claude in 1947 and Paloma in 1949. For a time, they lived together in the south of France, in Vallauris, where Pablo had begun working in ceramics, making plates and bowls and pitchers that he decorated with faces and animals, transforming functional objects into small sculptures. He made hundreds of ceramics, working with a freedom and playfulness that his paintings sometimes lacked by this point. The ceramics were intimate in scale, meant to be held, and they showed a side of him that was less monumental, more interested in craft and the pleasures of making. But Pablo was not faithful, and he was not kind. Françoise later wrote that he told her she was like a distorting mirror, reflecting back to him an image he did not want to see. He needed adoration, and when she did not provide it unconditionally, when she insisted on her own work and her own life, he resented her. He began an affair with another woman, and in 1953, Françoise left him, taking the children. She was the only woman who left him rather than being left, and he never forgave her. He tried to prevent her from showing her work. He cut her off financially. And when she published her memoir, Life with Picasso, in 1964, he attempted to have the book suppressed. He failed, and the book became a bestseller. It was a devastating portrait, honest and clear-eyed, showing a man who was brilliant and generous and also cruel, manipulative, unable to see other people as anything more than extensions of himself. François wrote, "He was a sun, and whoever came into his orbit was burned." The book broke the myth, or at least complicated it, and Pablo hated her for it. After Françoise, there was Jacqueline Roch, whom he met in 1952 and married in 1961, after Olga had finally died. Jacqueline was devoted to him in a way that none of the others had been, at least not for so long. She managed his household, controlled access to him, protected him from the world. She appears in more of his paintings than any other woman, hundreds of portraits where she is rendered in a wide variety of styles, sometimes recognizable, sometimes abstracted into shapes and colors. Pablo was in his 70s and 80s by then, and the paintings became increasingly prolific and varied. He painted variations on old masters, reworking Velázquez's Las Meninas and Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, inserting himself into the history of painting, claiming a lineage and also challenging it. He painted bullfights and musketeers, nudes and still lifes, working with an energy that seemed undiminished by age. The late paintings are controversial. Some critics see them as the work of a master who had nothing left to prove and who was exploring with total freedom, uninterested in whether the work was beautiful or coherent. Others see them as evidence of decline, repetitive and crude, the output of someone who could no longer edit himself. The paintings are often harsh and cartoonish, figures with exaggerated genitals and grotesque faces, colors that clash, compositions that seem thrown together. They are not serene. They do not have the elegance of his earlier work, but they have a raw vitality, a refusal to settle into the calm of old age. He was painting sex and death, the body in its most basic functions, and he was doing it with a directness that bordered on aggression. He was an old man confronting his own mortality, and the paintings are his way of insisting that he was still here, still capable of making, still taking up space. He died on the 8th of April, 1973, at his home in Mugens in the south of France. He was 91 years old. He had been working the night before, and he collapsed in the early morning. Jacqueline was with him. The funeral was small, private, and he was buried in the grounds of the Château de Vauvenargues, another property he had bought years earlier, at the foot of Mont Sainte-Victoire, the mountain that Cézanne had painted again and again. It seemed a fitting place, a final nod to one of the artists who had made his own work possible. The estate was in chaos. Pablo had never made a will, or if he had, it was never found. He left thousands of paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, and prints scattered across multiple properties, and the legal battles over the inheritance took years to resolve. His children, legitimate and illegitimate, fought for their share. Jacqueline controlled access to the work and to his memory, and she became a gatekeeper, deciding who could write about him, who could see the archives. She killed herself in 1986, shooting herself in the head, and the family battles only intensified after her death. Marie Therese had killed herself years earlier, in 1977, hanging herself in the garage of the house Pablo had bought for her, 4 years after his death. The wreckage he left behind was not just artistic but personal, a string of broken lives and unresolved grief. The work endured and the fame endured, and both only grew. Pablo had been the most famous artist in the world during his lifetime, and after his death that fame calcified into something closer to myth. His name became synonymous with genius, with the very idea of modern art. Museums mounted retrospectives that drew enormous crowds. Auction houses sold his paintings for record prices, tens and then hundreds of millions of dollars. He was everywhere, inescapable, a figure who had come to represent not just his own work, but an entire era's transformation of how art could look and what it could mean. But the myth began to crack, or at least to be questioned more openly. The treatment of the women in his life, which had always been known to those who paid attention, became a subject of broader discussion. The suicides of Marie Thérèse and Jacqueline, the breakdown of Dora Maar, the exploitation of women who were often much younger and who had little power in the relationship. These were no longer seen as unfortunate but irrelevant details. They were understood as part of the story, part of what made the work possible, and also part of what made the man monstrous. Françoise's book was read not as a betrayal but as a necessary corrective, a reminder that genius does not absolve cruelty, that the work and the life are not separate spheres but intertwined, each shaping the other. There were protests at exhibitions. There were essays and books arguing that his misogyny was not incidental, but central to his art, that the way he painted women fragmented, distorted, possessed was an expression of how he treated them in life. Others argued that the work should be judged on its own terms, that what he did in his personal life, however reprehensible, did not diminish the aesthetic and formal achievements of the paintings. The argument continues, unresolved, because it is not really an argument about Pablo alone, but about how we reckon with art made by people who caused harm, about what we owe to the living and to the dead, about whether beauty can be separated from the conditions of its making. Guernica remains in Spain, returned in 1981 after Franco's death and the restoration of democracy, now hanging in the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. It is still the painting people know best, the one that seems to contain everything he was capable of: formal brilliance, emotional power, political clarity. It is the painting that justifies the myth, that makes the claim for his importance feel inarguable. But it is also a painting about suffering, and it is surrounded now by the knowledge of suffering that he caused, and that proximity complicates the viewing. You can stand in front of Guernica and see a masterpiece, an image of protest and witness that has lost none of its force in the decades since it was made. And you can also think about the women whose faces were distorted in his paintings, who were turned into monuments of grief or vessels of desire, who gave him their youth and their bodies and their trust, and who were left with lives that were harder and sadder for having known him. The work is vast, almost incomprehensibly so. He made tens of thousands of pieces, and they are scattered across museums and private collections all over the world. You can spend a lifetime looking at what he made and not see everything. There are paintings that are unambiguous masterpieces, works that change the course of art history, and there are paintings that are minor or failed or simply strange, works that do not resolve into meaning or beauty, but that are interesting because they show him trying something, taking a risk. He refused to be consistent. He refused to be one thing. He was a cubist and a classicist and a surrealist and a ceramicist and a printmaker and a sculptor, and none of those labels fully contains him, because he moved through them all, using each as a tool or a language, and then moving on when it no longer served him. There are the early works, the blue and rose period paintings, that are full of a melancholy beauty, figures at the margins of society rendered with a tenderness that he would rarely achieve again. There are the Cubist paintings, those strange and difficult works that look like nothing else, that break the world into planes and reassemble it according to a new logic. There is Guernica, of course, and the paintings around it, the works that engage directly with war and suffering and political violence. There are the portraits of the women, hundreds of them, each one a record of a relationship and also a formal experiment, a way of testing what a face could become when seen from multiple angles, or compressed into 2 dimensions, or exaggerated until it became almost monstrous. There are the late paintings, wild and unruly, full of life and sex and death, paintings that seem to have been made by someone who had no time left and knew it. And there are the sculptures and the ceramics and the prints, each one a different way of thinking about form and material, each one showing that he could not be limited to a single medium or a single approach. He wanted to be everything, and, in a sense, he was. He was the most celebrated artist of his time, and he was the most powerful, and he used that power without much regard for the consequences. He believed in his own genius, and the world agreed, and that agreement gave him a kind of permission to act as if the normal rules did not apply to him. He could take a lover who was a teenager and no one would stop him. He could abandon women and children and the art world would look the other way. He could paint a woman as a weeping, fractured figure and it would hang in a museum and be called a masterpiece, and no one would ask what it cost her to be seen that way. And yet the work remains, and it is undeniable. It is possible to hold both things at once, that the paintings are extraordinary, that they opened up new possibilities for what art could be, that they are formally innovative and emotionally powerful and historically significant, and also that the man who made them was cruel, that he treated people as objects, that his genius was built in part on the suffering of others. These are not contradictions. They are both true, and they exist together, and the tension between them is not something to be resolved, but something to be acknowledged. What he gave the world was a new way of seeing. He took the human figure, which had been the central subject of Western art for millennia, and he showed that it did not have to be rendered as it appeared to the eye. It could be broken apart and reassembled. It could be seen from multiple perspectives at once. It could be abstracted into shapes and planes that had their own logic and their own beauty. He showed that art did not have to be a window unto the world, but could be an object in itself, something constructed and physical. He showed that tradition was not a constraint, but a resource, something to be used and transformed and argued with. And he did all this with a kind of relentless energy, a refusal to stop, or to settle, or to be satisfied. There is a photograph of him taken late in his life, maybe in the 1960s, standing in his studio surrounded by canvases and sculptures, and he looks directly at the camera with an expression that is both defiant and weary, as if daring the viewer to judge him and also knowing that the judgment has already been made. He is shirtless, his skin tanned and loose with age, and behind him are paintings of nudes and bullfights and abstracted figures, the accumulation of a lifetime of making. He is standing among the evidence of his work, and the work is everywhere, overwhelming, insistent. It is the record of what he did, and it is also the record of what he took, and both are visible if you look. The paintings hang in museums now, behind glass or roped off, and people move past them with audio guides and smartphones, taking pictures, reading labels. Guernica is in a room by itself, and there are guards and climate control, and a hushed atmosphere, the kind of reverence that major works demand. The women in the portraits are frozen in their poses, their faces distorted or serene or anguished, and we do not know what they were thinking when they sat for him, whether they felt seen or used or both. The blue period figures still huddle in their loneliness, and the rose period acrobats still stand in their barren landscapes, and the cubist guitars and bottles are still fractured across their canvases, and all of it is still here, still asking to be looked at, still insisting on its presence. He was not a good man, that much is clear. He was selfish and domineering, and he caused real harm to people who trusted him. But he was also someone who changed what art could be, who expanded the possibilities of the medium, who made paintings and sculptures that are unlike anything that came before them and that have shaped everything that came after. He was, in the end, exactly what he claimed to be, a force. And like any force, he left destruction in his wake alongside the creation. The question is, what we do with that knowledge now. Do we stop looking at the paintings because of what we know about the man? Do we look at them differently, with a kind of double vision that sees both the beauty and the cost? Do we teach the work and the life together, refusing to separate them? There is no single answer, and perhaps there should not be. The work exists in the world, and it will continue to exist long after everyone who knew him is gone, long after the arguments about his legacy have faded into history. The paintings will hang in museums, and people will stand in front of them and feel something, and that feeling will be their own, shaped by what they bring to the encounter. Pablo believed that art was a lie that tells the truth. He said it in an interview once, and it became one of those quotes that gets repeated because it sounds profound, and also because it is difficult to argue with. A painting is not the thing it depicts. It is pigment on canvas, a constructed illusion, and yet it can convey something true about the world or about the person who made it or about the act of seeing itself. His paintings are lies in that sense. They do not show the world as it is. They show it broken apart, reassembled, distorted, multiplied, but they tell a truth about his vision, about his obsessions, about the time he lived in and the questions that preoccupied him. They tell a truth about power and beauty and violence and desire, not in any simple or didactic way, but in the way that images can, bypassing language and argument and speaking directly to something less rational. There was a moment, probably in the 1950s or 60s, when a German officer came to his studio in Paris during the occupation and saw a photograph of Guernica. The officer pointed to it and asked, "Did you do that?" And Pablo answered, "No, you did." And Pablo answered, "No, you did." It is a story that has been told many times, and it may or may not be true. But it has the quality of legend, the kind of story that gets told because it captures something essential. Whether or not the exchange happened, it conveys what he wanted the painting to be. Not just a personal expression, but a political act, a way of making visible what power tries to hide, a refusal to look away. He stayed in the center of the art world for more than 60 years, longer than almost anyone else, and he stayed there because he kept changing, kept taking risks, kept refusing to settle into a single style or a single identity. He was always moving, always starting over, always willing to destroy what he had built in order to build something new. That restlessness was part of his genius, and also part of his cruelty. He could not let anything be, could not let anyone be. Everything had to be transformed, turned into art, made into something that served his vision. The Minotaur appears again and again in his work, especially in the 30s, and it is clearly a stand-in for himself. The Minotaur is a creature that is half man and half bull, powerful and monstrous, trapped in a labyrinth of its own making. In some prints and paintings, the Minotaur is gentle, blind, led by a young girl holding a candle. In others, it is violent, attacking women, embodying a kind of primal male aggression. He saw himself in both versions, or he wanted to be seen that way, as someone who contained multitudes, who was both creator and destroyer, artist and beast. It was a romantic view of himself, but it was also not entirely wrong. He was destructive. He did hurt people. And he also made things that have endured, that continue to shape how we see and think about art. The bulls and the horses in Guernica carry that same weight. The bull stands calmly while everything around it is chaos, and it has been interpreted as a symbol of Spain, of brutality, of the artist himself. The horse is agony, pure and simple, a creature in pain that cannot articulate its suffering except through the visual language of the body. Pablo refused to explain the symbols. He said they meant what they looked like they meant, that he was not interested in allegory. But the images are too powerful to be only themselves. They carry meaning whether he intended it or not, and that meaning has expanded over time, so that Guernica is now an image not just of a specific bombing, but of all bombings, all wars, all moments when the powerful turn violence on the defenseless. In the years after his death, the market for his work exploded. Paintings that had sold for thousands during his lifetime were selling for millions, then tens of millions, then over 100 million. The prices are absurd, disconnected from any reasonable measure of value, but they reflect the fact that he has become a brand, a name that signifies not just art, but wealth and status and cultural capital. To own a Picasso is to own a piece of history, to claim a connection to genius, and the very rich are willing to pay almost any amount for that claim. The paintings hang in private homes and bank vaults, and most people will never see them. The work has been privatized, turned into an investment, and there is something deeply ironic about that, given his professed communism, his claim to stand with the workers and the dispossessed. But some of the work is public, held in museums where anyone can see it, and that is where the work does what it was meant to do. A person can walk into the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or the Reina Sofia in Madrid, or the Musée Picasso in Paris, and stand in front of a painting and look at it for as long as they want, and in that moment, the painting is theirs. It does not matter who owns it legally. The experience of looking, of seeing, of feeling what the image conveys is free. That is what museums do, and it is what public art does. And it is the only real defense against the commodification that has overtaken his legacy. There are days when the arguments about him feel exhausting, when the need to constantly adjudicate between the art and the life seems like a distraction from the simple fact of the work itself. The paintings exist. They are there. They can be looked at, thought about, argued with, loved, or hated, or felt ambivalently toward. They do not require his permission or his biography to be meaningful. They have their own lives now, independent of the person who made them, and that independence is both a gift and a problem. The gift is that the work can be experienced on its own terms. The problem is that the work cannot be fully separated from the conditions of its making, from the hands that made it, and the life those hands were part of. Perhaps the only honest response is to hold all of it at once, the brilliance and the cruelty, the innovation and the harm, the beauty and the cost. To say that he was a genius and also that he was a monster, and that both of those things are true, and that either cancels out the other. To look at Guernica and see a devastating image of suffering, and also to think about Dora Maar, who documented its creation and who spent the rest of her life haunted by him. To look at the portraits of Marie-Thérèse and see the sensuality in the possession, the way he turned a young woman into an object of art and also into an object, full stop. To look at the Cubist paintings and see the formal revolution, and also to remember that revolutions are not bloodless, that tearing down the old structures means leaving rubble behind. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest artist of his time, and he is. He wanted his name to be synonymous with genius, and it is. He wanted his name to be synonymous with genius, and it is. But he is also remembered now as someone who used people, who turned relationships into raw material, who left a trail of pain that no amount of aesthetic achievement can erase. Both legacies are true, and they exist together, and anyone who looks at his work now has to decide what to do with that knowledge. The paintings are still there, still vivid, still strange and powerful and difficult. They have not aged the way some art ages, becoming quaint or decorative or easy to dismiss. They are still challenging, still asking something of the viewer, still refusing to settle into a single interpretation. That is perhaps the best argument for their continued relevance. They do not give easy answers. They demand attention and thought and engagement, and they reward that engagement with images that are unlike anything else, that open up new ways of seeing and thinking about form and color and space and the human figure. In the end, the work is what remains. The man is gone, and the people he hurt are gone, and the arguments about his legacy will continue long after everyone who knew him is dead. But the paintings and the sculptures and the prints are still here, and they will be here long after we are gone too. They will hang in museums and be reproduced in books and projected on screens, and people will look at them and have their own responses, shaped by their own experiences and their own sense of what art is for and what it can do. There is a late self-portrait painted when he was very old that shows his face as a rough, almost brutal mask, eyes staring out with a kind of defiant anguish. It is not a flattering image. It does not try to soften the reality of age or to present him as serene or wise. It shows him as he was, old, aware of his mortality, still making, still insisting on his presence. It is a portrait of a man who could not stop, who did not know how to be anything other than what he had always been, who worked until the end, because the work was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that did not require justification or apology. The painting hangs somewhere, perhaps in a museum or a private collection, and if you stand in front of it, you see a face that is both familiar and strange, a face that has been looked at by millions of people and that is still, somehow, impenetrable. You cannot know what he was thinking when he painted it. You cannot know what he was thinking when he painted it. You cannot know what he felt about his life, about the choices he made, about the people he hurt. The painting does not tell you. It simply shows a face rendered with the skill and the vision of someone who spent 90 years learning how to see and how to make others see. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the work does not have to redeem the life, and the life does not have to invalidate the work. Maybe they are two separate things, or maybe they are the same thing looked at from different angles, the way a Cubist painting shows a face from the front and the side at the same time, both perspectives true and neither one complete. Maybe the only way to understand him is to accept that he cannot be fully understood, that he was too large and too contradictory and too prolific to be reduced to a single narrative. He was many things and he was all of them at once, and the paintings are the record of that multiplicity, the evidence of a life lived without restraint, for better and for worse. The studio on the Rue des Grands Augustins is still there, though it is not his any more. Someone else works there now, or it has been turned into something else, apartments or offices or another artist's space. The Bateau L'Ivoire burned down in 1970, just a few years before he died, and it was rebuilt, but it is not the same. The places where he worked and lived have been absorbed back into the city, and Paris has moved on, as cities do. But the work remains, scattered across the world, in museums and private collections and storage vaults, and it will remain long after the places are gone, long after the memory of him as a living person has faded into the abstraction of history. There was a boy in Malaga who could draw before he could write, and he grew into a man who changed the course of art, and who also caused pain to people who loved him, and who made thousands of paintings and sculptures and prints, and who became the most famous artist in the world, and who died in the south of France on a spring morning, having worked the night before, still making, still trying to see something that no one else had seen. The story does not have a moral. It has an ending, but the ending is not a resolution. It is simply the place where the life stopped and the work continued, and where the arguments about what it all meant began in earnest, and where we still are looking at the paintings, trying to understand what they show us, and what they ask of us, what we owe to the art, and what we owe to the people who made it possible, and who paid the price for its making. The light in Malaga is still sharp and clear, and the Mediterranean is still there, and somewhere in a museum a child is looking at Guernica for the first time, seeing the horse and the bull, and the fragmented bodies, and they are feeling something they do not have words for yet, and that is what art does when it works, when it moves past argument and explanation, and speaks directly to the part of us that sees and feels before it thinks. And that is the gift, however compromised, however entangled with cruelty and ego and the wreckage of other lives. The paintings are there, and they are still speaking, and we are still listening, and the conversation continues.